Hi, Sophie.
Trina? Trina? Yeah, it happened again. I'm just going to start by explaining what this episode is. Because
Okay,
this is an
perfect.
episode we actually recorded like a few weeks ago when I had bronchitis. And I listened back and I sounded like one of the finger reader crones. It was just like, the fingers! Like that. It was terrible.
Unsalvageable.
But yeah, so this episode is going to be Trina and I discussing the fingers of Elden Ring.
So many.
So many fingers, so we're breaking it up by the number of fingers. It's going to be a countdown. We're going to start with 5 fingers.
Number 5.
Okay, so the five fingers is basically the greater will's kind of realm, right?
Yeah, yes.
When we see Radagon has an attack that comes out with 5 fingers. We have Placidusax, who has 5 fingers, and then we also have allusions to probably Placidusax, maybe somebody else, granting that same intelligence to the beasts.
The thing about intelligence being granted with the 5th finger is specifically one of the more interesting things about Elden Ring's kind of cosmology.
Agreed.
Because it's not presented as like sort of the great wisdom of the greater will comes down and it's this ecstatic experience where everyone's suddenly enlightened. It's presented more as like something about you physically changed, and with that, intelligence came into the world, but it comes into the world in the form of tool use.
Yes, very true.
It says that the beasts are granted 5 fingers, and then that leads to them sort of becoming craftsmen. They start making things, they start making weapons, and they start fighting each other. Which is very like 2001: A Space Odyssey.
And it's also very similar to actual real history when humans become humans as we know them today.
Exactly, because what it's doing, it's not doing like, here is the big mythic creation story where like man is fashioned from clay or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
It's presented as like there were just these like animals, and then when they got a 5th finger on their hands, that allowed them to start specializing in tool use.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what allowed them ultimately to dominate, which is, like you said, essentially the hypothesis around human evolution, that our distant ancestors, when they got a thumb, they could start gripping things in a way that they couldn't before, and that's what led to tool use, and that's what led to humans, proliferating in the way that they did, because once you're able to do tool use, you become more efficient at like foraging for food, you become more efficient at hunting, you can say like start building rafts and
You can
going
farm.
over bodies of water, you can farm, you can do all of these things that you couldn't do before, and that's essentially how this 5th finger thing is also working in Elden Ring.
Yeah, so in a lot of ways I think that they're making an allusion there to something that I'll bring up a bunch of times, which is God, true deities, like the final level of deity, so to speak, they almost always have the power of creation and destruction. And I find this 5th finger really apt in that way because it's kind of like God giving them the power to create things with their hands. And therefore, it's almost like giving a godly power to a beast. Because it's like a complete paradigm shift in what they're able to do with their surroundings, and they're allowed to like shape it to their will much more easily. So it feels like a very godly power and a very appropriate thing to be granted by God.
And it's also really notable that like what they're granted, it's just the 5th finger, and then everything proceeds from that. It's not like they're granted sort of the wisdom of the greater will on these like massive stone tablets or
True.
anything like that, although there are massive stone tablets in Elden Ring, which we'll get to. But what the Greater Will essentially is doing is it's just making them smart. And you sort of get, like, again, Elden Ring, the more that you break it down, the more it becomes very sci-fi rather than straight up fantasy.
Absolutely.
What it feels like it's doing is it's that theory that, like, some great power interfered with human evolution at some point in the past. Very, like, Ancient Aliens-y, but also it's like, well, why did it do that?
Yep.
And the more you look into it, it's like, well, what is the Greater Will essentially giving? Is it giving a fifth finger? Is it giving intelligence? Is it giving the ability to create tools, the ability to create civilization to these planets so that later on they are more amenable, they are more useful to it?
It does seem to actually want a vessel for the Elden Ring. And you probably can't be that or you probably can't be as effective of a vessel if you're just a beast, right? Or just like vying for influence with other outer deities. Like if you can influence the world in that indirect way, you can kind of play the outer god game a little bit better, so to speak.
It's also interesting that, like, when we hear about, like, the beast getting the 5 fingers, it starts alluding to, like, they started fighting with tools.
Mm-hmm.
And then the plot of the game, Greater Will grants them intelligence, they start fighting, and then even though they like to think that they're above the level of the beasts and they're beyond all of this, and there's all these, like, elden lords and these great gleaming cities, they're still just fighting each other.
I don't want to jump ahead, but it does make me think of, like, the one mistake that Hayata mentions. It's slightly, we can get to that when we get to the 2 fingers, but it's slightly unclear to me if that mistake is back at the beginning of creation, creating different creatures at all.
Yeah.
Or is it this other moment where they started introducing intelligence into the mix?
The other thing about 5 fingers, which we sort of alluded to at the start when you're bringing up, like, Radagon having that attack that produces a huge sort of 5-fingered hand on the ground, is that the 5 fingers is associated with the Greater Will, but we never encounter a 5 fingers. We encounter a 3 fingers and we encounter a 2 fingers. But the only time we really see the 5 fingers as a motif, it's people who have, like, that direct line to the Greater Will. It's Radagon and Placidusax, essentially. Yeah.
And the Elden Beast, for that matter.
And the Elden Beast, yeah. The Elden Ring itself is, like, the closest thing we have to, like, the Greater Will. Like, it's the closest. It's not the Greater Will, but it's like, this is the closest thing we have to it. It's like... Everything else is sort of within, like, 3 or 4 degrees of interpretation. Whereas the Elden Ring seems to be, okay, they literally just sent this thing. And...
You're right.
The Elden Ring is the thing that's powering Radagon in that fight, and he's doing the 5-fingered slam. And then when that ends, the Elden Ring, which is also the Elden Beast, it takes a form, and the first thing you see of the form is this big 5-fingered hand reaching out of the ground.
So it's fair to say that they're almost synonymous as far as, like, symbolic analysis goes.
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll get on to, like, that when we start talking about Goldmask, when we get to the 1 finger, about maybe the 3 fingers, the way that, like, the Elden Ring sort of manifests seems to be tied to, like, I don't know, like, it's very tactile in the way that it can take on other forms and be broken and reformed and things, even though, like, what is it?
Right. Very malleable.
To me, also, I think that the Greater Will manifesting as basically a giant hand is, like, itself really interesting, and it kind of tells you about what the Greater Will is, because it's almost like you don't really get a sense of, like, you can't talk to it, you can't really interact with it, but the fact is it's a big hand.
Yeah, it's the invisible hand.
Yeah. It's reaching out to these planets, and it's like, it's influencing them like a hand. It's like shaping them and molding them and grabbing onto them and ripping parts out of them. So I find that aspect really interesting.
Yeah, and I think that right there you hit my nail on the head, which is that I think the completeness that you're talking about is A, the power of order or the power to create, and B, the power of chaos or the power to destroy, which is another, like, super common, like, if you're the head deity, those are usually the 2 things you do. Like, Shiva does that, God does that in Abrahamic religions. So it's just like super common for God to do that. So it makes a lot of sense that like when you break them down, they're talking about chaos and order, and that's like kind of two halves of a complete deity.
Yeah, and the whole the whole of Elden Ring is all about things being like fractured into pieces and stuck back together again and
Yep.
all this other stuff. But then like it's really interesting then that the thing that is being fractured and broken, the prime deity, is 5, which you can't divide evenly. It has to be 3 or 2. You can't
Right.
actually
It
split
has to
that
be
into
two
2.
opposing things.
Yeah,
Is what it really has to be. It's a
Yeah.
divine, what do they call it? A divine paradox, which is
Yeah,
also
yeah.
just super common. If you can be a divine paradox, you're probably a god.
Yeah, and again, like when you look at the Radagon Marika fusion, like the whole point is they're completely different people.
Yeah, exactly.
Marika did not find someone who was like her to try to fuse with. She found someone who
Yeah,
was,
she never
in a
did.
lot of ways, yeah, she found someone who was like lesser than her in a lot of ways, greater than her in some ways, and because they weren't the same, they fitted together.
Well, that brings us perfectly to the Four Fingers.
Number 4.
The Four Fingers, like, I'm gonna say early on that it's a little bit fuzzy on the metaphor side of things, but they do have like enough to say something. Four Fingers are generally unlucky. My theory is perhaps that is expressing what you were talking about here about Marika not combining with someone similar to her. If she is like a Lord of Order,
Yeah.
and she joins with another Lord of Order, which is what maybe the 2 and 2 fingers and a 4 fingers represents, they're just going to be like in constant clash with each other. You can't make 2 different orders at the same time, basically.
The other thing is like they talk about 4-fingered beasts, 4-toed beasts. The things with 4 digits are unlucky. So obviously, if a beast's got the 4 digits, that means it's the beast that it didn't get that greater will juice.
It didn't get the juice.
Weirdly, I want to do a little asterisk here. The Fingercreepers, right? They have 12 fingers.
So many.
Number 12.
But it's expressed as 3 4-fingered hands fused together.
Oh, is it?
Number 4.
I think we should talk about them now because I don't want to count all the way down to 12, but like,
yeah,
they are interesting in that like the places that you find them are places where something is going horribly wrong with the greater will.
Going wrong with the greater will in particular is very important there.
Yeah, because it's like Caria Manor where Rani is plotting to overthrow everything.
Okay.
Mount Gelmir where Rykard is plotting to overthrow the Erd Tree.
Yeah.
So those two together, like people point out like it looks like Rykard's hand. Yeah, because there's this whole thing about like you can find a weapon that's literally a giant finger.
Yep.
It looks like the finger from a finger creeper. It says it's from the ancestor of the finger creepers, but it's Rykard's finger.
What does that mean, Miyazaki?
This is why I sometimes step back and I'm like, can we talk about the development process for a second? Because it stops us going down like weird rabbit holes trying to justify.
True.
The whole thing is that finger item in like, I think it's the Chinese version or something, version 1.0 China, it just straight up says this is Rykard's finger. It does not mention finger creepers at all.
Mm-hmm.
So my whole take on that is probably like it was just going to be the thing you got from Rykard's remembrance. It was going to be called like the traitor's finger or something.
Yeah.
What are we going to do with it? Oh, we'll just say it's from a finger creeper. But then this led to this whole thing about like, well, are they from Rykard? They must be like from Rykard.
Right.
They get it because there's one at Mount Gelmir. There's actually a few at Mount Gelmir. And they're also Caria Manor where Rykard's from. But then it's like, well, why are they at the mountaintops?
Right. The mountaintops in particular is like, Rykard's never really even gone there yet.
Technically, anyone who wants to burn the Erd Tree would have gone to the mountaintops.
But he hasn't gotten up off his ass.
Well, he couldn't fit.
Fair.
But like that's kind of nothing to do with Rykard. But it is to do with like this is the thing that threatens the greater will if you let that flame out.
Mm-hmm.
And it's around where the battle with the fire giants happened. So it's like this is the fight that like everything is in jeopardy because it can be burned. And the other place you find it that's definitively what the hell does Rykard have to do with this place is the Lanedale sewers. Another place Rykard cannot fit.
I don't even know why they would be there. I don't really have a good guess.
No, because that's where you find all the ash and shit that was left over from when they tried burning the Erd Tree the first time.
Okay, fair.
It's where you find, it's like this big ash and destroyed area where you find Lionel's corpse.
Oh, okay. Okay, that's what you're talking about. I know exactly what the spot. Yep.
Yeah.
With the Omen killer that everybody hates.
With the Omen Killer, yeah, because it's like, this is where, like, this is the remnants of you trying to burn the Erd Tree.
Okay.
And not succeeding.
Yeah.
And you also find them outside Dung Eater's room.
Yeah. They don't want Dung Eater to win.
Yeah, Dung Eater is like, no. Like, this guy is like if he gets in the Elden Ring, he's screwing everything up. So looked at that way, it's like, these are things that, like, I said ages ago that they felt like it's like the Greater Will is spawning them to, like, protect itself.
Yeah.
But I think it may not be that direct. It may just be like, yeah, like the Greater Will is starting to go wrong and it's manifesting as these, like, deformed hands.
Unlucky.
Very unlucky, because it's 3, which is the bad fingers, and then there's 3 or 4, which is the other bad fingers, so that's the worst fingers.
That's definitely bad. Well, should we move on to 3?
Number 3.
You can run wild with this, and I do on my channel.
Go for it.
I'll give you the intro here, but I want to actually hear your opinion on her actual rant.
Okay.
So, the 3 fingers, as we discussed, is kind of like a symbol for chaos. And it's underground, it's Underlane Dell, where the nomadic merchants are kept. One thing that I wanted to touch on at first is, at what point does the 3 fingers come into existence? So, my take is that the 3 fingers always existed. And that because Placidus Axe has 5 heads in his art and stuff, and you can actually find all 5 stumps if you look hard enough, that means that they're just like an inherent part of that divine duality that we mentioned at the very start, and that they're just always there, and that the merchants just kind of like tapped into that at some point. But it's a little bit shaky, because doesn't it? Is it the wording in the items that makes it shaky? I can't remember exactly what.
There's a lot of things make it shaky.
Let's hear it.
Okay, so the question of, like, when did the 3 fingers actually show up?
Mm-hmm.
The thing about the fingers, right, is that in the Eternal Cities, there is that blade that is specifically called the Finger-Slaying Blade.
Yes.
And we know that the Greater Will was in the Eternal Cities. It was overseeing them. And then it mentions that, like, their vassals were killed, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's always calling the 2 fingers like the vassal fingers of the Greater Will.
Right.
So we can assume that they probably had 2 fingers in the Eternal Cities, but maddeningly, you never actually see one. You don't see a dead 2 fingers anywhere.
No, you're right. Just the mummies.
Yeah, but that's the thing, is it says, like, the Greater Will and its vassals. It's called the Finger-Slaying Blade. Okay, probably used it to kill some fingers.
Mm-hmm.
But you find it under what they call the chair crypts. So there's this, like, massive fuck-off skeleton in the chair crypt.
Mm-hmm.
That we know that's not a statue, because you find chair crypts without anything in them. Like, it's literally that is a chair. And it's wearing gold, which to me is like, okay, that's probably the demigod equivalent of the Eternal Cities, because the gold is the Greater Will. Nothing else in the Eternal Cities is gold. They're all silver, but there's this one golden thing. And you find the Finger-Slaying Blade under one of the corpses.
So did they kill those guys?
Is that the vassal, and it's just called the Finger-Slaying Blade because it can hurt the fingers, and that's why Rani wants it, but in the Eternal Cities it was called something else. That's the key to, like, what is the timeline of the fingers themselves, because it's like, were they in the Eternal Cities, yes or no? Because those were a long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it's like, the game isn't clear
Mm-hmm.
on if that was actually 2 fingers or just really big guys in chairs. And the fact it's not clear about that means, like, there's just this question hanging over, like, do the 2 fingers and 3 fingers come into existence with Marika?
Right.
Like, are they something that comes into being when the Elden Star impacts? because you do find the three fingers quite near that assumed impact point.
Okay, that's actually a definitely reasonable, like, secondary time when it could have happened. They could come into being.
This is where it starts to get, like, contradictory and a little weird. More so, because
Mm-hmm.
there's this thing called the fingerprint shield, and it's literally, like, it's
Awesome.
a big slab of rock with a big fingerprint on it. And it says, like, this was the old tomb of an ancient god.
Yes.
And when people ran their fingers across those fingerprints, they could hear the words of the god, right?
Yep.
So that's presumably that's the three fingers.
Right, and that's a point in the they were always around column.
And then, like, that itself, like, where the frenzy starts is also, like, a little odd, because they talk about Shabriri. What interests me specifically about Shabriri is that they talk about Shabriri was blinded, and it's like with time the frenzy began to like form in his empty eye sockets. But then it talks about how, like, the beginning of frenzy sprouting was the fingerprints upon the door of the ancient god's tomb.
They really can't decide.
No, but I'm wondering if they're the same thing, because if Shabriri's blind, he's basically feeling around everywhere. Did they lock Shabriri up, like, underground like the merchants, and Shabriri is feeling around because he can't see anymore? His sense of touch is heightened, and he's running his hands down that door. And he's starting to get the words of the three fingers inside him, and that's the beginning of it. But then there's this other weird thing where, like, when you're in the consecrated snowfield, there's just, like, a frenzied area with no humans in it. It's just, like, rats and trolls. And you find the Eye of Yellow, like, growing there. And, like, when did this happen? I'm assuming there were humans there at some point, because they would have had to build the actual, like...
The astrologers.
Yeah, were the astrologers frenzied? Was Shabriri up there?
He could have been an astrologer. I was thinking he could also be like the first fire monk. So
something like that. Because they mention that, like, Shabriri has his eyes put out for slander, and then they mention that the merchants had heretical beliefs.
Burning the Erd Tree.
Well, yeah, like, Marika doesn't like your beliefs, you get locked up. So did she do that with Shabriri? Is that what happened?
Yes. That's my guess. There's no proof. I can't. I'm doing my best out here, so... The one other thing I wanted to mention was that I think Shabriri's blindness is, makes him uniquely able to hear those words in the first place. Just like Hayata. Hayata's got the same thing, and it's like you dull one sense to heighten another, which is very common for, like, people who are trying to communicate with God. They do stuff like that.
Yeah, and, like, who's the other person who communes with the three fingers? It's Hayata.
Yeah, exactly.
Who is blind, yes. Do you want to talk about Hayata's little lore dump?
Yes. It's my favorite lore dump, so I'll just read it off for us. I have touched them, the words of the three fingers. As your maiden, allow me to divine them. All that there is came from one great. Then came fractures and births and souls. But the greater will made a mistake. Torment, despair, affliction, every sin, every curse. Every one born of the mistake. And this is the mistake I mentioned earlier where I was unclear about which mistake it is. And I'm leaning towards the intelligence answer as I'm writing this. And so, what was borrowed must be returned. Melt it all away with the yellow chaos flame until all is one again. And this is where I want to get your opinion, because you can really go hog wild with it, and sometimes I do. But I want to hear maybe a slightly more metered take on it.
I think the most interesting part to me is that Hayata is describing essentially, like, the creation of everything. She calls it, like, the one great, and that led to this thing of, like, is that the greater will? But the consensus now is, like, that's just a translation thing. She actually means everything came from one great thing. So what she's describing is essentially like the Big Bang. Like everything is compressed into one spot.
It's
Goes
exactly.
bang, and the universe comes from that. And then she says, but the greater will made a mistake. So that all implies like the greater will has some role in creation.
Good point.
Because we know of all these other outer gods, like the Scarlet Rot, the Formless Mother, that just seem like, okay, this is vaguely like Lovecraftian outer gods that are warring over this planet. And it's tempting to think of the Greater Will as just one of those. Like the Greater Will is just one of the other outer gods that are warring over the planet. But then what Hayata is implying is the Greater Will actually had some role, like that was hugely significant in the birth of everything. And the universe that we're now living in is, in a sense, the fault of the Greater Will. Like, it did that. Even if it's not the prime mover, it's like the organizing principle.
Yes.
Things like the Scarlet Rot and the Formless Mother and maybe the Blood Star, whatever the hell else is going on, those are almost like interlopers.
I was wondering if that perhaps they are themselves fractures of the greater will.
Yeah, that's possible too.
If it really is one great, then there's only, like, in my interpretation of like Big Bangedness, that means there was nothing before. So like the greater will has nothing to do but divide themselves.
Yeah, which is going back to that the recurring use of alchemical symbolism in the game, where it's like there's like the prima materia, and then everything is fractured from that.
Exactly, and you can presumably conjoin it all together again one day.
Yeah, it's like the greater will itself is this vast cosmic alchemist that has attempted to create a universe, but it hasn't gone as planned. I guess discussing the fractures and everything, like, this to me is like the interesting part of Elden Rings, the way that it ties like the cosmology of the world to just like human experience. Because to me, that's kind of why like it's resonated with me in a way that like other things haven't, because it's getting all these big cosmic ideas and it's like tying them back to just like everyday relationships between people.
Yeah, they're all nicely packed metaphors for like everyday, well, maybe not everyday interactions, but like the big ones that you have to deal with. Like,
it's this story of how like everything once is complete and then there's these fractures and everything breaks apart. And because everything's broken apart, nothing is whole and it's seeking to reconnect. But the fact that it's broken and fractured is what's driving it to connect back together, which is why people get attached to each other. It's why people have obsessions. It's why because there's that constant sense of like there is something lacking, and that's driving our needs and our desires. You know, they have a real good as above so below thing going in Elden Ring.
Which is what astrology is all about, baby.
And that's essentially what the Flame of Chaos is doing. It's like, if you've got something missing and you feel like you can never have it, and it's like, I would rather the world stopped existing than I felt this lack, I felt this pain. That's when it starts coming. That's when the Flame of Chaos starts coming. So, like, Edgar, like, he gives in because he loses his daughter.
Right.
But the reason it is affecting him so badly is because he loved her so much. And, like, it happens with Yura being possessed by Shabriri. That, like, the last thing that Yura does before he's possessed is he has that confrontation with Eleonora, who he doesn't outright say it, but it's very heavily implied that, like, he had a thing for her.
Yeah, he's in love.
The world is now so painful, I wish it no longer existed. That's where the frenzy's coming from. I guess the other real important frenzy character is Vyke. In Vyke's case, like, it seems to come from him trying to protect someone. Vyke's story essentially is that Vyke reaches the mountaintops and then he turns back around and goes down to the frenzied flame. And, like, it's not 100% stated outright. But what happens to us when we're following in Vyke's footsteps is when we meet Shabriri, he tells us, like, hey, Melina's gonna burn, but if you take the flame of frenzy into yourself, you can be the kindling and she'll survive.
Okay.
Presumably that is what happened to Vyke.
Absolutely.
Vyke gets up there, he doesn't want his maiden to burn, he doubles back, goes down. But then when you find Vyke as an invader after he is frenzied,
Mm-hmm.
there is a dead maiden nearby.
Yep.
So presumably what has happened is he gets frenzied, tries to hold the flame inside him in order to save her, and then he ends up killing her.
Yeah, he just loses it before he makes it to the final goal.
There's a ghost near where you encounter the frenzied Vyke, and
Mm-hmm.
they say, like, you were not a lord at all in the end. Like, we await the
Oh,
true
right.
lord of the
And it's a
frenzied
frenzy
flame.
village. Okay.
Yeah,
Right.
so it's like, what did Vyke do wrong? Did Vyke fail because he wasn't in despair enough? Because if he goes down there for what are assumed to be, like, honorable reasons in that he's trying to save someone,
Mm-hmm.
and she's still alive when he goes down there, is that why? Is he actually trying to control the frenzy rather than let the frenzy through, and that's why he's not the lord?
Yeah, and then the levees break at some point.
Shabriri gives in because presumably he, like, loses everything.
Mm-hmm.
Edgar gives in because he loses his daughter.
Vyke hasn't even lost anything at that point when he meets the Three Fingers.
Yeah, I'm wondering if is Vyke just not, he's not in despair enough.
Well, either way, he blew it. He didn't do the DLC content.
Number 2.
The Two Fingers are the current vassals, so they're representing the Greater Will as best they can, because, yeah, as we talked about, the Greater Will may have manifested quite differently in the time of the Eternal Cities, for example. But they're very imperfect. I would say they're very not complete. So they ultimately become these two little antennae that can receive the word of God, but you still need another step, which is the finger reader crones, to help you interpret what the heck they even said.
It's just really fleshing out that idea of, like, this is an entity that is so unlike us that, like, you can't even communicate with it directly. It has to be like 4 or 5 things removed from that. It reminds it's like that philosophical question: if a lion could talk, could you understand it? And it's like, no, because the consciousness of the lion is so unlike the consciousness of a person that even if you shared the same language, you would not be able to relate to each other. And the greater will always feels like that. It's like, what the hell is this thing? We have to talk to, like, an old lady who is talking to 2 giant disembodied fingers who are themselves talking to the greater will.
The presence of these finger readers is a really cool way that historical astrology gets to, like, keep its foothold. Even though the astrologers are gone, palm reading is actually something that originates from Indian astrology. You're interpreting the words of God, so it's like 1-to-1.
One thing that we hear about the Two Fingers initially being much more full of life and vigor. Like, it mentions that they would wiggle, and when they
Mm-hmm.
wiggled, they would spell out messages in the air
Yeah.
made of light, and that's further, like, emphasized when we find the coded sword and the cipher parter.
The language of light.
I'm not going to say we don't see them do it in game, because we know that you can't get into Langdell because they literally stick a big, like, glowing barrier around it. And the reason they do that is because the Two Fingers are tasked with guiding the Tarnished to fix the Elden Ring. But what's kind of interesting there is that this seems like a contingency plan.
They stated as such, I think.
The whole point is the Tarnished get exiled. Suddenly, the demigods all go to shit, and then the Two Fingers, like, we need the Tarnished back again.
Yeah.
And that's essentially, like, what Var is getting at when you talk to him, and he's like, they don't actually care about us.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we were exiled, we were shunned, we weren't allowed back in the lands between, and then the second the Two Fingers thought we were useful, we got pulled back again. But he's saying the Two Fingers are doing it. He doesn't say the Greater Will's doing it. they are like antenna. They are relaying what the greater will wants, but they're also completely independent creatures.
Right. Yeah.
They're not just like the greater will has shoved two fingers in the ground that it uses to speak to people. Like the two fingers are a sentient thing. They have their own end game that is not necessarily the same as the greater wills. I think because every planet that they're going to is going to be slightly different. But like they talk about the two fingers specifically as like they're quite cynical. So their job is to do things like they're calling the Tarnished back, but they're also doing things like they're the ones who pick the Empyreans. Like their job is to choose the royal successors. Greater Will's not doing that. The fingers are doing it. They're the ones who are like operating a secret police force to assassinate Tarnished who don't do what they're told. That's the fingers. That's not the greater will. And yet there's an implication. It comes from Vari again, who specifies that like when the Elden Ring was shattered, that's when the two fingers kind of lost.
If you fuck with one part, it's gonna make all the other parts affected.
Yeah, but interestingly, like if you fuck with one part, it just affects the other parts. They're not actually operating as one single entity with a single goal. They completely freak out when the Erd Tree gets burned. And I think that is tied to the whole like multiple roundtables situation.
Because they're like literally inside the Erd Tree, perhaps, in that little room.
Well, it's that, but it's also like, why are there multiple roundtables to begin with? You hear about the two fingers, and they operated a secret police force.
Right.
Like, they had the confessors. They had these, like, black-clad confessors wandering around. If there's any Tarnished straying from the path, they were assassinated. That's all happening in, like, the physical roundtable that is in Leyndell.
Yep.
What is interesting also about that roundtable is, like, there is a throne in it where a human could sit, where the two fingers is now. Roundtable hold was, like, that's Godfrey's.
Yep.
Like, it's got Godfrey's crest all over it.
This is thing. Yeah.
Yeah, this is Godfrey's, like, old keep, and Leyndell was presumably built around it. That's also where you find, like, there's all that ash from the first time they tried burning the Erd Tree, and there's, like, the big Erd Tree roots reaching down. So you get the impression that, like, despite the two fingers assassinating Tarnished who stray from the path, all this stuff, the Erd Tree still got burned. Which presumably happened, like, it was the time of, like, Vyke and Istvan and Bernal and all these other people. Also really interesting that you find Vagram there, because Vagram's whole thing is, like, he's the Glowmite Queen's champion.
I never know what to think of him.
I think he's kind of interesting, because they mention that, like, he's the Glowmite Queen's champion, also that the Glowmite Queen is an Empyrean that the Fingers chose. So at some point, like, she was, I guess, in their good graces. Like, this is why I've always seen the Glowmite Queen as, like, along with the, like, is she Melina stuff? Or is Melina, like, a reincarnation? But, like, the fact that, like, the Fingers picked her as a potential, like, queen. Is she, like, one of Marika's children who we don't hear about?
Yeah. I always go with Marika's twin.
Yeah, like her twin or her child, because it's like... I mean, this was its own episode, but basically, like, the weird thing is, like, the Glowmite Queen's whole deal is that she's holding Destined Death, right? Marika's Golden Order doesn't start until she confines Destined Death.
Oh, good point.
Logically, she can only hold Destined Death after the Golden Order is created, because prior to that, the rune is in the Elden Ring. I tend toward Child just because Melina does her little Glowmite Queen tribute act at the end.
And she says, like, oh, my mom.
I mean, this is its own episode we did. I'll link it.
Yeah.
The whole thing was
you're
just
right,
like,
you're right.
My mother gave me a purpose. What's my purpose? I've got to go to Leyndell to find it. I went to Leyndell, met my mother. Not too happy with it. Let's go release Destined Death now. So that strikes me as, like, your purpose was to keep Destined Death safely away, and you didn't do it. The thing I wanted to say, which I got a little sidetracked about Roundtable, is that, like, there's this new Roundtable that's created, and it's created with a two fingers on the throne, but there's not the throne there anymore. Like, they're where the throne would be. So it's almost like everything goes to shit in the Roundtable, So they make their own new round table.
Mm-hmm.
Only this time there's no Godfrey.
Right.
No, people are only allowed in if I say they can come in, and the Two Fingers is literally just watching the whole time.
Oh yeah, one last thing before we run away from the Two Fingers. I just wanted to get your take on the fleshy ones that Ronnie has.
Okay, so one of the weirder parts of Elden Ring is the way that, like,
Mm-hmm.
every demigod gets its own Two Fingers. Even though Rani has slain her flesh and is now this, like, incorporeal spirit, she still has to kill her Two Fingers. It's like there's some connection there. The weird part to me about the multiple hands, though, is how does she move it? Yeah.
Yeah. How did she get it from on top of a tower to under this moon thing? It's kind of like magical hand waving.
Literal magical hand waving.
Yeah.
My take on that is, like, that Two Fingers, presumably it was on the tower. Like, it's not like she just happened. Her Rani, your special, your Two Fingers is buried here. That place that you find it, it's called Manus Celeste. I know, like, I initially thought, oh, it's like Celestial Hand, because, like...
Yeah, I thought something close to that.
Yeah, but the actual, like, if you translate that directly, it's Hidden Hand.
Okay.
So it's like the Cathedral of the Hidden Hand. And if you look at where it is, it's like, it's on a place in Lyonia where, like, the Greater World seems to have not as much influence, because it's got, like, you can see, like, all the rays of silver starlight are coming down. You can see Rani's Dark Moon there.
Yep.
And there's, I think, is that the only place you see it? I think it's there and, like, the ending, and that's it.
I think so.
Yeah. This is the question. I don't know how she does it. Rani takes the Two Fingers from her tower.
Yeah.
And it's almost like she's like disempowering it. Like, she's burying it, and she's burying it in the place where, like, there's all the starlight and the dark moon is watching.
Yep. It's like playing interference with its celestial rays, in my opinion.
It's almost like Marika and the Three Fingers. Like, Rani's got this thing that threatens her. So she's going to bury it, but she can't quite get rid of it until we give her the blade. Like, her whole plan, like, that cannot proceed until that specific Two Fingers is dead. So it's got some sort of authority, but I don't know what. The other thing about the Two Fingers, which is, like, the Two Fingers' whole plan involves you having to get inside the Erd Tree. You can't get into the Erd Tree unless you burn it. They don't want you to burn the Erd Tree. And the last time someone burned the Erd Tree, they lost it and sealed everyone inside, like, a weird reality bubble version of Roundtable. Do they have an end game, or are they just really stupid? Because there's no solution to this.
I do lean towards they're really stupid.
It reminds me of, like, it's like the Age of Fire and Dark Souls, where, like, everyone involved in it, including the people who are perpetuating it, know that it's not sustainable. But their entire, like, society, religion, philosophy, worldview is predicated on the Age of Fire continuing. So they just have to keep it going. So I'm wondering if it's, like, it's just this, like, you keep bringing up paradoxes. It's like, it's this paradoxical situation the Two Fingers are in, where it's like, the Golden Order must be restored, must be fixed, but key to the Golden Order is the Erd Tree.
Right.
So we can't have anything bad happen to the Erd Tree, but we also can't fix the Golden Order without anything bad happening to the Erd Tree, so they just sit there. And I think that's why they freak out and do the little antenna thing when it gets burned. Because, like, well, I think they've realized, like, yeah, what are we supposed to do?
Yeah, wait, we lose no matter what. They kind of got a raw deal, honestly, from the Greater Will. At least the Two Fingers currently around.
Yeah, and the thing is, like, once you do actually burn the Erd Tree and go inside, you do fix it. Like, that is what they wanted.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think it comes down to the way that Enya says, like, the burning of the Erd Tree is a cardinal sin. So it's almost, like, bureaucratic.
Yeah.
It's just the law. You're not supposed to burn the Erd Tree. Don't burn the Erd Tree. That's, like, the most important thing. So even though we have to burn the Erd Tree in order to save it, we're still not allowed to burn it.
They're fucked.
Yeah. It's like the whole like Marika like is all powerful and a lot of her behavior doesn't make sense, but that's because it's her own neuroses.
Mm,
So in the case of the two fingers, it's like it's their own like dogmatic obsession with like what is the cardinal sin that prevents them from actually fixing things.
right.
Yeah.
They're too worried about like their their world staying the way it is.
Yeah. Yeah. So this brings us to we got one finger left.
Number 1.
There's our finger. There's Goldmask's finger.
Yes.
There's the bloody finger. There's Eleonora's finger. And there's a bunch of finger items that we use to interact with other Tarnished.
So that's a good way to start it off. The fingers themselves can connect you to someone else, but that someone else could be a person, or, and I think we'll find in the next few examples, oftentimes that connection to that other being is a deity.
Yeah.
So yeah, let's start off maybe with the bloody fingers. And you mentioned that the bloody fingers, there's an initiation to get in. You have to meet Vare, and he has to hurt your finger to get you into the club, so to speak. When I first did that, I assumed that they were cutting your finger off, and it was one of those like, well, we're not going to make a whole new model for that, so they just don't show it afterwards. But you explained to me about Eleonora and how Yura is like trying to convince her to chop off her finger, right?
Yeah, and he does.
Okay. Oh, and he does convince her to do it.
Okay, so what happens is like this is what we mean about Yura is like clearly in love with her, even though he doesn't say it. Where he's like,
Mm-hmm.
you yielded to your cess blood. Don't let it take your fire. Don't let it take like what made you you.
Mm-hmm.
And that's interesting because the other bloody fingers that you fight, like Nereus, whoever it is in outside Raya Lucaria, the raptor guy.
Oh yeah, the raptor guy.
Yura has no problem killing them. Like they just die. When he gets to Eleonora, he doesn't want to kill her. He just wants to cut that finger off because that finger is her link to Moog. So when Yura meets Eleonora, he just wants to cut the finger off so she's no longer linked. I also wonder if, like, this doesn't really matter either way, but is it, like, you still fight Eleonora? She's still a red phantom bloody finger.
Right. Huh. So whose finger did he even cut off?
Well, then you meet Yura and he's possessed by Shabriri.
Right.
So is it that he tries to save her, he cuts the finger off?
It wasn't enough.
It wasn't enough and she's still a bloody finger. And that's why he loses it and becomes Shabriri.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah. Okay, so the other thing I just wanted to mention about this whole finger severing is that we're talking about an index finger. My first just like initial statement to begin the conversation is that I believe that the one finger can connect you, the person, to the greater will. And that's why we have all of those finger items that come from the good guy finger items, I would call them. That come from like the two fingers and stuff like that. But the Moog faction, which is actually answers ultimately to the Mother of Truth, is like this alternate deity, right? So if you're trying to take that connection to the greater will, you could sever it, could cut off the finger, and maybe they wouldn't be able to speak to gods at all. But instead, I think what they're doing here is injuring the finger so that you can redirect that deity to human connection. It makes a lot of sense that you would have to go through this wounding and that pain, much like the way the two fingers spoke with light and the way the three fingers speak with touch and that braille stuff, maybe the Mother of Truth speaks through this pain.
Yeah, something that you brought up is that painting of the creation of Adam.
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
Literally, the finger is reaching up to touch God.
Right, and God's just like barely touching him, and that in that moment it's described that is like how you get the wisdom of the Lord.
And I think like that's very similar to how like it's working in this, but it's doing it in a way that's like really doubling down on the idea that like the greater will is incomprehensible.
Absolutely.
This is going to apply to everything we talked about, but you think of like, what does a hand do? Hands can, like, they shape things, they mold things, they can lift things and move things, but they can also gesture.
They can write, yeah.
They can also, you can write with a hand, you can make signs with a hand. It really goes all in on, like, all the things a hand can do for why they have chosen a hand as, like, the symbol of the greater will. But also, like, people watching this would be familiar with, like, the use of hands in, like, propaganda images. Beware the hand of something. There is a hand reaching out that's going to grab you, like,
Mm-hmm.
and that's also what the greater will is doing. It's reaching out and it's grabbing and taking. But it's taking by molding and it's taking by shaping. So the use of the fingers in this, it's like they're working like Braille. They're working like you can feel the greater will. You can feel the imprints it's leaving in things. You can also gesture and you can also use them as an antenna like the two fingers are doing. We mentioned when we were talking about the three fingers that Goldmask is similar to Shabriri. Shabriri gets his, presumably it's Shabriri, touching this massive fingerprint.
Yep.
But then Goldmask is doing it, and he's not actually, like, he's not pointing up. He's not trying to get in contact with God like in Creation of Adam. He is interested in, like, the dogma of the Erd tree. He's actually bypassing the two fingers entirely.
He's acting as they do, like an antenna.
Yeah, because, like, Gideon, for instance, Gideon goes and speaks to the two fingers, and they're the ones that fill him in on what's going on. And yet Goldmask's whole thing is, like, he's bypassing it entirely. He's literally just, I'm getting it direct from the Erd tree. And presumably the two fingers are not happy about this.
It's really interesting that he chooses to do all these aesthetic things, like not eating, not wearing clothes, and all that stuff, because in many, many religions, whenever you're trying to achieve an ecstatic experience and speak to God, that's like the exact strategies they use. They try to make themselves more of an antenna for that information by, dulling the senses, like Shabriri does with having no vision. And then Goldmask just like does the exact same thing, just takes it to a really extreme, so he's able to, well, speak directly to the tree, so to speak.
The other thing about Goldmask is, like, this is weird because it's technically in the game. It's not remarked on, which is that in the opening, where you're seeing, like, all the, like, the tarnished roll call with, like, the ever brilliant Goldmask, and you see that Goldmask he's like sitting on this, like, some sort of inscription.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a Golden Order symbol, and he's got this little mortar and pestle and some gold dust, and he's, like, describing sort of the symbol with the gold.
Mm-hmm.
And that to me is, like, that's really similar to the fingerprint Great Shield thing, where it's like he seems to be picking up, like, vibrations and shapes and things with his hand as he's running it across this design.
He's divining slightly differently than he would normally.
But the fact that he's divining it that way at all is interesting. Like Marika, she's like, Golden Order's not going to be a mystery anymore. We're going to get to the bottom of the Golden Order. And the way that Marika does it is there's just all these scrolls and tablets everywhere that she's been reading.
Oh, we're talking about all the ones that are stacked up in her room?
And it's a combination of those big stacks of clay tablets, but also just scrolls that are written. So it's like she's grabbing from, like, presumably a very ancient, like, way of understanding the world in the form of these clay tablets.
Well, probably the Dynasty, because the old Dynasty, they have all those tablets on all of their statues.
Well, yeah, like the whole there's literally a Babylonian map of the world just used in that. It's on that statue, yeah. And, like, that character is, like, it's never outright stated who that is. But you get the impression, like, this was probably, like, the Marika or the Goldmask or something of that time. This, like, figure that appeared bearing the wisdom of the greater will. So I guess that brings us to the final one finger, which is the player's finger.
Okay, what you got?
Oh, just the way that as you're going through the game, you meet the finger readers and, like, show me your fingers. I'm like, oh, this one's important.
Right.
Yeah.
That's pretty... I don't know what to say about it.
The finger readers are not just the readers of the two fingers.
Right, like everybody has a fate.
Yeah, yeah, and because presumably that finger is your link to the divine.
It's kind of like reading the ripples of the cosmos in a way. You know, like in these games, the cosmos are often described as like an ocean. And if you're like a soul being formed by that ocean, I imagine you kind of like a pearl almost. And like you would still have like or a rock or whatever thing is like rolling around on the bottom of the seafloor. You're going to have imprints from that experience. And that's like, again, exactly how astrology works. At the God can't like speak through it directly, but he already did. Just like forensic science at that point.
So thank you very much, Trina.
Yeah, this is a great one, and I'm glad we redid it because we're on point, baby.
And we were a lot more on topic this time.
Yeah, true.
Yeah. So last time we did this, you mentioned that you and your partner were working on a project.
Yes, absolutely.
So do you just want to spruik that for a little bit?
Yeah, so we're making a fantasy RPG video game. It's just got a working title right now of Bog Witch. We're thinking about calling it Hysteria. We'll see. But it's a really cool project, and it's going to be my first game, but it's my girlfriend's like fourth game that she's released now. So she's great. She's my artist. I'm the programmer. And if you want to check out the progress of this game, I do a blog over on Instagram, and I'll give Sophie the link so you guys can go over there. And I do like a new blog post every couple months. So it's gonna come out kind of fast. We're gonna do an alpha, so we're gonna release it with like the first 3-ish zones I think done. And yeah, it's just been going great. So I don't have enough good things to say about my partner, Hyacinth.
And do you just want to quickly plug your own social media, like your YouTube channel,
course.
your Twitter? Yeah.
So I'm saying Trina everywhere, but usually it's spelled with leet speak, so it's S41NTTR1N4. And I'll give you all the links as usual. And yeah, I will be releasing new lore in the next couple of weeks, so look forward to that.
So thank you, yep, and that's a wrap, I think.
Thank you, Blackguard. That was delicious.